dear friends of ancient tales and lovers of Greek mythology. Welcome to this peaceful corner where the old stories live on, where gods and goddesses walk through your dreams, and where the mysteries of Mount Olympus unfold like silk beneath the stars. Tonight, we journey together into the silver realm of Artemis, the maiden goddess of the moon, whose light has guided countless souls through the darkness for thousands upon thousands of years. Before we begin our gentle voyage through the moonlit forests and sacred groves of antiquity, if you find comfort in these whispered myths and ancient lullabies, please consider subscribing to Greek Myths for Sleep and leaving us soft like on this video. Your kindness helps these timeless stories reach other weary souls seeking rest, other dreamers yearning for the peace that only the old tales can bring. Now, let yourself sink into comfort as we begin our story beneath the eternal moon, where Artemis reigns supreme in her domain of silver light and shadow. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the ancient words carry you away to a time when the world was young, when magic flowed like rivers through the land, and when the goddess of the hunt danced through forests that have long since turned to dust and memory. In the beginning, before Artemis drew her first breath, there was anticipation in the heavens. The Titaness Leto, beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, carried within her the children of Zeus, king of the gods. But Hera, Zeus' wife, burned with jealousy that turned the very air around her to poison. She decreed that no land under the sun would welcome Leto. No place would offer shelter to the mother who bore her husband's children. And so Leto wandered, heavy with divine life, searching for a single spot of earth that would dare defy the Queen of Heaven. The waves whispered her sorrow. The winds carried her tears across the ancient world. Day after day, night after night, Leto moved across the earth like a shadow, her divine light dimmed by exhaustion and fear. The very ground seemed to shrink from her footsteps. Islands sank beneath the waves rather than offer her refuge, and mountains turned their faces away. But the fates had woven their threads, and destiny cannot be denied, not even by the jealousy of gods. At last, when hope had nearly fled her heart entirely, Leto came upon Delos, a floating island that drifted upon the wine-dark sea like a dream half-remembered. Delos was not anchored to the ocean floor like other lands, and so it existed outside Hera's decree. Here, beneath palm trees that swayed in the gentle Mediterranean breeze, surrounded by the singing of the waves, Leto found her sanctuary. The island welcomed her with open shores, and there, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, she prepared to bring forth new light into the world. But even in this moment of respite, pain found her. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto labored, calling out to Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth. But Hera, in her bitterness, had detained Eileithyia on Olympus, holding her close with promises and threats. The other goddesses, moved by Leto's suffering, finally sent Iris, messenger of the rainbow, to bring Eileithia in secret. They offered her a necklace of gold, 9 cubits long, a treasure beyond price, and at last the goddess of childbirth descended to ease Leto's pain. First came Apollo, golden as the dawn, bringing music and prophecy into the world with his first cry. But our story tonight follows his sister, who emerged into the world just moments before him. Or perhaps it was after the myths disagree, as they often do when speaking of divine mysteries. Artemis entered the world with eyes already ancient, already knowing. Some say she helped deliver her own brother, serving as midwife mere moments after her own birth. Such was her strength and wisdom even then. The newborn goddess opened eyes that held the silver of the moon, the green of the deepest forest, the amber of a deer's gentle gaze. In that first moment of life, Artemis knew herself completely. She was the wild places, the untamed spaces, the boundary between civilization and wilderness. She was the protector and the hunter, the virgin eternal, the light that guides through darkness. Even as an infant, divinity radiated from her like heat from a flame, and all of nature recognized its mistress. Zeus, gazing down from Olympus, felt his heart swell with pride at the sight of his daughter. When she was but 3 years old, though time moves strangely for the immortals, he sat her upon his mighty knee and asked what gifts she desired. Little Artemis, with the solemnity of mountains and the certainty of rivers, made her requests. She asked for eternal maidenhood, never to be touched by marriage or the bonds that tie women to hearth and home. She asked for a silver bow and arrows fletched with moonbeams. She asked for a short tunic that would not hinder her as she ran through the forests. She asked for 60 ocean nymphs to be her companions and 20 river nymphs to tend her hounds and her sacred deer. But most of all, she asked for the mountains. All the mountains of the world to be her domain, and just one city, for she knew she would rarely visit the haunts of men. Zeus laughed, a sound like distant thunder rolling through summer skies, and granted all her wishes and more. He gave her 30 cities instead of one, and made her the guardian of crossroads and harbors. He declared that women in the pangs of childbirth would call upon her name, remembering how she had aided in her own brother's birth. And so Artemis grew, if indeed gods can be said to grow, into her power and purpose. The Cyclopes, those ancient craftsmen with single eyes burning in their foreheads, forged for her a silver bow that could shoot arrows of moonlight. Pan, the wild god of shepherds, gave her 13 hounds, each one swift as thought and fierce as winter storms. Their names have echoed through the ages: Amaranthus and Torellas, Hylias and Nape, and all the others who could catch the wind itself between their teeth. The goddess chose her companions carefully. 60 daughters of Oceanus, all 9 years old, came to serve her, their laughter like the babbling of brooks, their movements fluid as water. 20 nymphs of the river Amnesis became her handmaidens, tending to her golden deer and polishing her silver arrows until they gleamed like stars. But Artemis demanded purity from all who served her. They must remain untouched, unmarried, devoted only to the hunt and to their mistress. The penalty for breaking this vow was transformation or death, for Artemis guarded her own chastity and that of her followers with the ferocity of a mother bear protecting her cubs. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath and even the wind sleeps, Artemis would lead her companions through the forests. Their feet made no sound on the moss-covered earth. Their passing disturbed not a single leaf. They moved like shadows, like thoughts, like dreams half remembered upon waking. The goddess taught them the language of the trees, the songs of the streams, the secret names of every creature that drew breath beneath the canopy of green. The hunters of mortal men would sometimes glimpse them in the distance, a flash of silver through the trees, the sound of laughter like bells in the mist. But any who tried to follow found themselves lost, wandering in circles until Artemis took pity and led them back to the paths they knew, for the wild places were hers, and she decided who might enter and who must stay away. One of her most faithful companions was Orion, the great hunter whose story intertwines with hers like ivy around an oak. He was the son of Poseidon, bearing the gift of walking on water as easily as land, tall as a tree and strong as the tide. Some say Artemis loved him, the only man who ever touched her heart, though their love was as chaste as morning dew. They hunted together through the seasons, matching each other arrow for arrow, stride for stride. Orion could track a deer through a blizzard, could shoot a flying bird in perfect darkness. In him, Artemis found a companion who understood the joy of the hunt, the sacred dance between predator and prey. But the fates are cruel, and even the love between friends can end in sorrow. The stories of Orion's death are many, each one a different shade of tragedy. Some say Apollo, jealous of his sister's affection for the mortal man, tricked her into shooting Orion as he walked far out upon the sea. The god of the sun pointed to a distant speck on the waves and challenged his sister's skill, knowing she could not resist. Her silver arrow flew true, piercing the head of her dearest friend. When the waves carried his body to shore, Artemis wept tears that became the morning dew, and she placed Orion among the stars where he hunts forever through the night sky. Others tell that Orion, drunk on his own prowess, boasted he would kill every beast upon the earth. Gaia, the Earth Mother, sent a giant scorpion to humble his pride. The battle was fierce, shaking the very foundations of the world. But in the end, the scorpion's poison found its mark. Artemis, finding her companion's cooling body, could not bear to be separated from him. She lifted him up to the heavens, where he continues his eternal hunt, forever pursued by the scorpion, forever pursuing the Pleiades. In her grief, Artemis became even more protective of her sacred spaces and those who dwelt within them. The story of Actaeon serves as a warning to all who would violate the sanctity of the wild. He was a young hunter, grandson of Cadmus, trained by the centaur Chiron in all the arts of woodland and chase. One hot afternoon, when the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, Actaeon separated from his hunting companions to seek water and shade. The forest led him, though he knew it not, to a sacred grove where a silver spring bubbled up from the earth, feeding a pool clear as crystal. This was the place where Artemis came to bathe after the hunt, to wash the dust and blood from her divine form. Hidden by ferns and flowering vines, surrounded by her nymphs, the goddess let the cool water flow over her shoulders, unaware that mortal eyes were about to violate her privacy. Actaeon pushed through the undergrowth and froze. There before him was a sight no mortal man was meant to see: Artemis in her natural glory, water droplets catching the dappled sunlight on her silver skin. The nymphs cried out, rushing to shield their mistress with their bodies, but it was too late. The goddess' eyes, cold as winter moonlight, met those of the young hunter. Without a word, for words were unnecessary when divine justice moved, Artemis cupped water in her hand and flung it at Actaeon's face. Where the droplets touched, transformation began. His fingers lengthened into hooves, his skin sprouted soft brown fur, antlers burst from his skull like branches from a tree. His voice, which might have begged for mercy, became the wordless cry of a stag. In moments where a man had stood, now trembled a deer, eyes rolling in terror, understanding still human though the form was beast. The cruelest part of the transformation was that Actaeon retained his human mind, trapped within the body of the very creatures he had spent his life hunting. He fled, crashing through the undergrowth, but the sound of his flight attracted his own hounds. They did not recognize their master's scent beneath the musk of deer. The pack gave chase, their baying echoing through the forest, a sound that had once filled Actaeon with joy, now heralding his doom. At the last, as teeth found his throat, he tried to call out his name, but only the death cry of a stag emerged. Yet Artemis was not always harsh in her judgments. She could show mercy as infinite as her wrath was terrible. Consider the tale of Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon, whose story shows the goddess' compassion for innocent maidens. When the Greek fleet gathered at Aulis to sail for Troy, they found themselves trapped by windless days. The seas lay flat as glass, the air still as death. Day after day passed with no change, and the warriors grew restless. The ship's stores dwindled. The seer Calchas, reading the signs, declared that Artemis was angry. Agamemnon had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself, after killing a sacred deer in her grove. Now she demanded a price for his hubris, the sacrifice of his eldest daughter, Iphigenia. The king raged and wept, but the pressure of his men and his own ambition won. He sent for his daughter under false pretenses, claiming she was to wed the great warrior Achilles. Iphigenia came to Ollys with joy in her heart, dressed in wedding finery, accompanied by her mother Clytemnestra. But instead of a marriage altar, she found a sacrificial stone. Instead of a bridegroom, she found a priest with a blade. The girl understood in an instant the betrayal, the price of men's wars and pride. Some say she went willingly to the altar, choosing duty over life. Others say she had to be carried, weeping for the life she would never live. But Artemis, watching from Olympus, took pity on the innocent girl. As the blade descended, the goddess swept Iphigenia away in a cloud of mist, leaving a deer in her place on the altar. The men saw only what they expected to see: blood and death and divine appeasement. The winds began to blow, filling the ship's sails, carrying the Greeks toward their destiny at Troy. Meanwhile, Artemis carried Iphigenia to the land of the Taurians, in the distant regions near the Black Sea. There, she installed the girl as her high priestess, giving her a new life far from the machinations of her father. For years, Iphigenia served in the temple, tending the sacred flames, performing the rituals, finding peace in service to the goddess who had saved her. The wild moon looked down on her with approval, and she grew strong and wise in her exile. The goddess' protection extended beyond individual maidens to entire communities of women who chose the path of chastity and devotion. In the mountains of Arcadia, in the forests of Ephesus, in hidden groves throughout the ancient world, temples to Artemis rose like prayers in stone and wood. Here, women could find sanctuary from unwanted marriages, from the demands of men who saw them only as possessions. They became priestesses and hunters, healers and scholars, free beneath the moon's gentle light. At Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world rose in Artemis' honor. The temple of Artemis there was different from her worship elsewhere, for the Ephesian Artemis had taken on aspects of the ancient mother goddesses of Anatolia. She was depicted with multiple breasts, symbolizing abundance and nurture, yet still maintaining her essential wildness. Pilgrims came from across the known world to worship at her altar, to ask for her protection, to find solace in her shadows. The rituals performed in her honor were as varied as the goddess herself. At the Arctea, young girls dressed as bears and danced in her sanctuary, learning the ways of the wild before taking their place in civilized society. The ceremony remembered a time when a sacred bear was killed, and the goddess demanded young maidens serve in her temple as recompense. They would run and play, growl and tumble, free for a time from the constraints that would soon bind them. On moonlit nights, her worshippers would process through the forests, carrying torches that flickered like earthbound stars. They sang hymns that have been lost to time, words that spoke of silver light and shadow, of the hunt and the harvest, of blood and birth, and the eternal cycle of life and death. The goddess herself was said to join these processions sometimes, running ahead of her followers as a white doe, looking back with eyes that held the wisdom of eternity. But we must speak too of Artemis' role as the bringer of death, for she who protected women also released them from suffering when their time came. She was called the gentle killer, whose silver arrows brought painless death to women, as her brother Apollo's golden shafts did to men. When a woman died suddenly, without illness or violence, people would say that Artemis had claimed her, had decided her hunt on earth was finished. This aspect of the goddess was not feared, but welcomed, for death at Artemis' hand was a mercy. She would appear at the bedside of those whose pain had grown too great, whose bodies had become prisons. Her touch was cool as moonlight, soft as moss. She would whisper of the forests that awaited on the other side, of eternal hunts through meadows that never knew winter, of springs that never ran dry, and the dying would smile, reaching out to take the hand of the goddess who had protected them in life and would guide them in death. The duality of Artemis protector and destroyer, nurturer and hunter, virgin and midwife, reflects the duality of nature itself. She embodies the paradox of the wild, beautiful and terrible, giving and taking, forever beyond the full understanding of mortal minds. In her, the ancient Greeks saw the truth that civilization tries to forget, that we are all part of the wild world, subject to its laws, dependent on its mercy. Consider the story of the Elodi, giants who sought to storm Olympus itself. Attis and Ephialtes were the sons of Poseidon, growing 9 fathoms tall, strong enough to pile mountain upon mountain in their assault on heaven. They imprisoned Ares in a bronze jar and declared they would take Artemis and Hera as their brides. The gods trembled at their strength, for these were no ordinary giants, but beings of divine blood who might actually succeed in their mad plan. Artemis, faced with the prospect of forced marriage, the violation of everything she held sacred, devised a cunning plan. She transformed herself into a beautiful deer and ran between the 2 brothers as they hunted, both giants, eager to present such a prize to win her favor, threw their spears at the same moment. But Artemis vanished at the last instant, and the spears found their marks in the brothers' hearts. They fell like trees in a storm, their blood soaking into the earth, their ambition dying with them. This cleverness, this ability to turn the violence of men against themselves, appears again and again in the stories of Artemis. When the hunter Orion's friend Oenopion blinded him for attempting to violate his daughter, Artemis guided the sightless giant to the forge of Hephaestus, where he could be healed. When the river god Alpheus pursued her, driven mad with desire, she covered herself and her nymphs in mud until they were indistinguishable from the earth itself, and the god passed by, frustrated and alone. Yet perhaps the most telling story of Artemis' nature is that of Niobe, whose tale serves as a warning against hubris. and a revelation of the goddess' fierce loyalty to her mother, Leto. Niobe was a queen, blessed with 7 sons and 7 daughters, each more beautiful than the last. In her pride, she boasted that she was greater than Leto, who had only borne 2 children. She ordered the people of Thebes to worship her instead of the Titaness, to bring their offerings to a mortal queen rather than the mother of gods. The words flew on the wind to where Leto sat in her sacred grove, and her divine children heard their mother's hurt. Apollo and Artemis descended from Olympus like a storm, their faces terrible in their beauty, their eyes holding the promise of retribution. Apollo drew his golden bow and struck down the 7 sons as they exercised in the palace courtyard. Their bodies fell like wheat before the scythe, one after another, until the stones ran red with royal blood. Artemis found the 7 daughters in their chambers, huddled together in terror as the cries of lamentation rose from below. The goddess paused for a moment, seeing their youth, their innocence, their beauty that was not their fault. But divine justice, once set in motion, cannot be halted by pity. Her silver arrows sang through the air, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. 6 daughters fell, their lives extinguished like candles in the wind. The youngest daughter, Chloris, fell to her knees before the goddess, her face pale as the moon itself. Some say Artemis spared her, moved by her youth or her humility. Others say that Niobe threw herself over her last child, begging for mercy, and that the arrow meant for Chloris pierced both mother and daughter. The truth, like all divine truths, shifts with the telling, but all agree on what happened next. Niobe, bereft of all her children, fled to Mount Sipylus, weeping as she ran. Her tears fell like rain, endless and bitter. The gods, their justice satisfied, took a final pity on her. Zeus transformed her into stone, but even as stone she weeps. To this day, travelers say, you can see the rock formation that was once Niobe, and in the spring, when the snow melts, water runs down the stone face like eternal tears. These tales of transformation, Actaeon into a stag, Niobe into stone, the Elodie tricked into destroying each other, reveal the fluid boundary between forms in the world of Artemis. In the wild places, transformation is always possible. A woman might become a tree to escape unwanted pursuit. A man might become a wolf if he looks too long into the forest's heart. A child might become a bear and back again. The shapes we wear are temporary, the goddess teaches, but the essence remains. This fluidity extends to Artemis herself, who appears in many forms throughout the myths. Sometimes she is the tall huntress, silver bow in hand, moving through the forest with her pack. Sometimes she is the luminous moon, sailing through the night sky in a chariot pulled by 4 golden-horned deer. Sometimes she is a bear, protecting her cubs with fierce devotion. Sometimes she is a child, dancing with her nymphs in meadows of asphodel. In her lunar aspect, Artemis governs the tides of women's bodies, the monthly cycles that mirror the moon's own waxing and waning. Ancient women would pray to her for regular cycles, for easy births, for the strength to endure the demands placed upon their bodies. They understood what modern minds sometimes forget, that the same force that pulls the tides also pulls at the blood, that we are all subject to celestial rhythms, whether we acknowledge them or not. The connection between Artemis and childbirth might seem strange for a virgin goddess, but the ancients understood that knowledge does not require experience. Artemis had witnessed birth from her first moments of existence, had helped bring her brother into the world. She knew the pain and the power, the danger and the joy. Women called upon her not as one who had given birth, but as one who stood at the threshold, guiding souls from one world to another. In Sparta, young women honored Artemis with wild dances and competitions of strength. They would race and wrestle, hunt and swim, building their bodies strong for the trials ahead. The Spartan understanding was that Artemis favored women who were not weak or delicate, but powerful in their own right. A woman who could run down a deer could surely survive childbirth. A woman who could draw a bow could surely protect her children. The goddess temples often stood at boundaries between city and wilderness, between land and water, between the mortal world and the divine. At these liminal spaces, the usual rules softened. Here, a slave might speak as freely as a citizen. A woman might walk unaccompanied. A child might glimpse mysteries meant for older eyes. Artemis governed these threshold places, these moments of transition where anything might happen. As night deepens around us, let us speak of Artemis as the moon itself, for this aspect brings us closest to understanding her essential nature. The moon is constant, yet ever-changing, present yet unreachable, influencing all life yet touched by none. It illuminates without burning, guides without compelling, watches without judging. These are the qualities of Artemis herself. On nights of the full moon, her worshippers would gather in clearings, on mountaintops, beside still waters that reflected her silver face. They would dance until dawn, their movements becoming wilder as the night progressed, casting off the constraints of civilization with each turn and leap. Some claimed to see the goddess herself joining the dance, her feet barely touching the ground, her laughter like wind chimes in the breeze. But Artemis of the new moon was different, darker, more dangerous, walking the line between seen and unseen. This was when she hunted the spirits that plagued women in childbed, the demons that stole breath from newborns, the shadows that crept into homes uninvited. With arrows of darkness, she would pierce these malevolent forces, protecting those who could not protect themselves. The waxing moon was Artemis the maiden, growing in power and confidence, leading her nymphs in games and contests. The waning moon was Artemis the crone, wise and terrible, knowing all the secrets that darkness hides. though she remained eternally virgin. She contained all stages of womanhood within herself, a paradox that spoke to deeper truths than logic could encompass. Her sacred animals reflected this multiplicity. The deer, graceful and swift, represented her gentler aspects. The bear, fierce and protective, showed her dangerous side. The hunting hounds spoke of loyalty and pursuit, but perhaps most telling were the bees, for Artemis was also called Melissa, the honeyed one. Her priestesses at Ephesus were known as Melisae, worker bees in the great hive of her temple, creating sweetness from the pollen of prayers. The relationship between Artemis and her twin brother Apollo forms one of the great partnerships in mythology. Where he was the sun, she was the moon. Where he brought reason and order, she brought instinct and wildness. Where he favored civilization and its arts, she cherished the untamed places. Yet they were bound by more than blood. They were two halves of a cosmic whole, day and night in eternal dance. Sometimes they worked together, as when they slew the children of Niobe, or when they defended their mother's honor against the giant Tydeus, who had dared assault Leto. Their arrows flew in perfect harmony, gold and silver lightning striking down those who would harm what they loved. But sometimes they clashed, as when Apollo tricked Artemis into killing Orion, or when they took opposite sides in mortal conflicts. During the Trojan War, Artemis favored the Trojans, while Apollo's loyalties shifted with the winds of fate. She protected the Amazon warriors who came to Troy's aid, recognizing in them kindred spirits who lived outside the bounds of traditional womanhood. When Penthesilea, the Amazon queen, arrived to fight for Troy, Artemis granted her such prowess that even Achilles was impressed before he struck her down. The goddess' involvement in the war went beyond mere favoritism. She sent plagues when her priests were dishonored, calmed storms when proper sacrifices were made, and guided the arrows of those who honored her. Yet she also showed mercy, spiriting away those about to be unjustly killed, replacing them with animals or phantoms. The battlefield, after all, was just another kind of wilderness, where the laws of civilization meant nothing, and only strength and cunning prevailed. But let us turn from war to the quieter aspects of Artemis worship, for not all her stories are written in blood. In many places, she was honored as Potnia-Thuron, the mistress of animals, who governed not through violence, but through understanding. Hunters would pray to her not just for success, but for wisdom to take only what was needed, to kill cleanly and without cruelty, to maintain the balance between human need and natural abundance. The goddess taught that every hunt was a sacred act, a participation in the great cycle of predator and prey that kept the world in balance. The hunter must respect the hunted, must understand that today's predator might be tomorrow's prey. She showed this truth in the fate of many who forgot it. Hunters became the hunted. The powerful became powerless. The living became offerings to the ever-hungry earth. In her groves, Wounded animals would sometimes appear, and her priestesses would tend them with herbs and prayers. It was said that animals healed by Artemis' servants would never again fear humans, would walk freely between the wild and civilized worlds. Some became messengers, carrying prayers from her temples to her ears. Others simply lived, proof that mercy was as much a part of nature as violence. The goddess' influence extended even to plants, for certain herbs were sacred to her, Artemisia, of course, which bears her name, but also amaranth, which symbolizes immortality, and cypress, which grows in graveyards and speaks of the thin veil between life and death. These plants were used in her rituals, burned as incense, woven into crowns, scattered on her altars. Each had its own properties, its own prayers, its own connection to the goddess of the wild. Women would gather these herbs by moonlight, singing soft songs to avoid startling the plant's spirits. They believed, as many still do, that plants gathered with proper reverence were more potent than those torn carelessly from the earth. Artemis rewarded those who understood that taking from nature required giving back a prayer, a song, a promise to use the gift wisely. The goddess temples often included gardens where these sacred plants grew alongside others used for healing. Here, knowledge was passed from priestess to initiate, from mother to daughter, an unbroken chain of wisdom stretching back to the first woman who noticed that willow bark eased pain, that mint settled the stomach, that lavender brought peaceful sleep. This too was Artemis' domain, the ancient knowledge of healing that arose from careful observation of the natural world. As we drift deeper into the realm of sleep and story, let us consider the lesser-known aspects of Artemis, the local variations that show how deeply her worship penetrated the ancient world. In Brahran, she was the bear goddess, protector of young girls. In Taurus, she was the terrible virgin who demanded blood sacrifice. In Ephesus, she was the many-breasted mother. In Sparta, she was Orthia, before whose altar boys were whipped to prove their courage. Each aspect was true. Each face was real, for Artemis contained multitudes. She was not a simple goddess with a single nature, but a force as complex as the wilderness itself. Those who tried to pin her down to one aspect found themselves lost in contradictions. Virgin and midwife, hunter and protector, death bringer and healer. She was all these things and more. The mysteries of Artemis were not like those of Demeter or Dionysus, with their formal initiations and secret knowledge. Her mysteries were open to all who had eyes to see them written in the turning of the seasons, in the phases of the moon, in the delicate balance between civilization and wilderness. To understand Artemis was to understand that humans are not separate from nature, but part of it, subject to its laws and rhythms. This understanding brought both comfort and terror. Comfort in knowing that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that the same forces that move the tides and turn the seasons move within us. Terror in recognizing our own wildness, the thin veneer of civilization that barely contains the animal within. Artemis reminded her worshippers that they were both human and beast, divine and mortal, creators and destroyers. In the stories of those who encountered her, we see this duality reflected again and again. Some she blessed with her presence, appearing as a tall woman with eyes like stars, offering guidance or protection. Others she cursed for their presumption, their violation of sacred laws, their failure to respect the boundaries she guarded. There was no predicting which face of the goddess one might see, for she responded not to words or offerings, but to the heart's true nature. The hunter who killed for sport rather than need might find his arrows always missing their mark. The woman who preserved her chastity against all pressure might find paths opening through impassable forests. The child lost in the woods might discover a silver doe leading them home. The king who cut down a sacred grove might watch his kingdom wither like leaves in autumn. Justice and mercy flowed from Artemis like water from a spring, pure and impartial. Her influence extended beyond the mortal world to the realm of the gods themselves. Even Zeus, king of Olympus, treated his daughter with wary respect. He had given her independence when she was barely old enough to speak, had granted her wishes without reservation. Perhaps he saw in her something of the old powers, the forces that existed before the Olympians claimed their thrones. Artemis alone among his children never bent to his will, never compromised her nature to please him. This independence made her a figure of hope for mortal women trapped in societies that offered them few choices. In Artemis, they saw a possibility of freedom, of self-determination, of value beyond their roles as wives and mothers. Her priestesses lived lives impossible for most women traveling freely, studying herb lore and astronomy, making their own choices about their bodies and futures. Even those who could not join her service could pray to her, could carry a small piece of her wildness in their hearts. The goddess' reach extended to the edges of the known world and beyond. Wherever Greeks established colonies, they brought Artemis with them. But she was not a jealous goddess who demanded exclusive worship. She merged easily with local deities who shared her domains: huntress goddesses, moon goddesses, protectors of women and wild things. In this way, her worship spread and evolved, taking on new aspects while maintaining its essential core. In the Black Sea regions, she merged with the great goddess of the Taurians, becoming darker, more demanding of sacrifice. In Anatolia, she absorbed aspects of Cybele, the ancient mother of gods. In Crete, she was associated with Britomartis, the sweet maiden who chose transformation over violation. Each merger added depth to her mystery, new faces to her ever-changing nature. Yet, through all these transformations, certain elements remained constant. The moon was always hers, whether she was called Artemis or Diana or Selene or any of 100 other names. The wild places answered to her call, whether they were Greek forests, or Roman woodlands, or barbarian wastes. Women in childbirth invoked her protection in every language, under every sky. The essential truth of Artemis, that there is divinity in wildness, power in choosing one's own path, transcended cultural boundaries. As the night grows deeper and sleep creeps closer, let us speak of the quieter moments in the goddess mythology, the peaceful interludes between dramatic confrontations. Picture Artemis at rest in a moonlit glade, her silver bow unstrung beside her, her hounds sleeping at her feet. The nymphs have sung themselves quiet, and even the night birds have hushed their calls. In these moments, the goddess simply exists, at one with the forest that is both her domain and her true self. Sometimes mortals would stumble upon these peaceful scenes, hunters who had lost their way or shepherds seeking strayed flocks. If they were wise, they would retreat silently, understanding that they had glimpsed something not meant for human eyes. But sometimes they would linger, enchanted by the sight of divinity at rest, and in her mercy, Artemis would let them watch. They would return to their villages changed, carrying with them a vision of peace that would sustain them through all their mortal troubles. The goddess found joy in simple things, the perfect flight of an arrow, the baying of hounds on a fresh trail, the feel of wind in her hair as she ran faster than thought through her beloved forests. She delighted in the company of her nymphs, their easy camaraderie born of shared purpose and mutual respect. Together, they would bathe in hidden springs, braid flowers in each other's hair, compete in friendly contests of skill and speed. These idyllic moments balance the stories of her wrath, reminding us that Artemis was not cruel by nature, but fierce in protection of what she loved. Her anger was always provoked, never random. Those who respected her boundaries, honored her sacred places, and treated her followers with dignity had nothing to fear from the goddess. Indeed, they might find unexpected aid in their times of need, a clear path through a dark forest, a spring of fresh water in a desert, a swift death when suffering became unbearable. The relationship between Artemis and mortal women was particularly complex and beautiful. She was their protector, but also their liberator, showing them that there were alternatives to the paths society laid out for them. Not every woman could become a priestess or a perpetual virgin, but knowing that such choices existed gave them strength. They could carry a piece of Artemis within them, her independence, her refusal to be diminished, her connection to forces older and stronger than the laws of men. Young girls about to be married would cut locks of their hair and leave them at her altars, a symbol of the wildness they were leaving behind. But the goddess' blessing went with them into their new lives, a reminder that marriage need not mean the complete surrender of self. Women who had lost children would bring offerings to her temples, finding comfort in the knowledge that Artemis, who guided souls between worlds, had taken their little ones gently, even in cities far from her beloved wilderness. Artemis was present. Urban temples created sacred groves within their walls, small pockets of wildness where her worshippers could remember their connection to the natural world. Trees sacred to her cypress, amaranth, cedar grew in temple courtyards, their roots deep in city soil, but their branches reaching toward the same moon that silvered distant forests. The goddess festivals brought the wild into the heart of civilization. During the Brauronia, the city of Athens would send young girls to serve at Artemis Sanctuary in Brauron, where they would live as her sacred bears for a year. The Artemisia saw women dancing with abandon, temporarily freed from social constraints. The Maunikia honored her as the moon goddess with round cakes that glowed with tiny candles, earthly moons offered to the celestial one. But perhaps the most beautiful of her festivals was the Thargelia, celebrated when spring turned toward summer. Though primarily associated with Apollo, Artemis played her part as his twin and counterpart. The festival began with purification, the casting out of scapegoats who carried the community's sins into the wilderness Artemis domain, where all things could be transformed or destroyed. Then came the celebration of first fruits, the acknowledgement that civilization's bounty depended on nature's grace. The duality of the festival purification and celebration, casting out and gathering, imperfectly expressed the balance between Apollo and Artemis, civilization and wilderness, order and chaos. Neither could exist without the other. The city needed the wild places to absorb what it could not contain. The wilderness needed the city to give meaning to its existence as other, as the untamed space beyond walls and laws. This balance appears throughout Greek thought, but nowhere more clearly than in the worship of the divine twins. Apollo might be the god of reason, but without Artemis' instinct, reason becomes cold and lifeless. Artemis might govern the wild emotions, but without Apollo's restraint, emotion becomes destructive madness. Together, they represented the full spectrum of human experience, the need for both logic and intuition, both culture and nature. In the healing temples, this partnership was particularly evident. Apollo might diagnose the illness, but Artemis provided the herbs to cure it. He might interpret the dream that revealed the cause of suffering, but she guided the ritual that released it. Patients would sleep in the temples, hoping for visions from both deities, understanding that true healing required both the physician's art and nature's medicine. To the wounds of the spirit, women who had suffered violence would come to her altars, finding in her fierce independence a model for their own recovery. Those who had lost their way literally or metaphorically would pray for her guidance, trusting the huntress who never lost a trail to lead them home. Her healing was not always gentle sometimes. It required the cutting away of what had grown corrupt, the burning out of infection. But it was was always transformative. As we near the end of our journey through Artemis myths and meanings, let us return to her essential nature as the eternal virgin, forever untouched and untouchable. This virginity was not about physical purity alone, but about completeness unto herself. Artemis needed no other to define her, no partner to complete her, no master to command her. She was whole in her aloneness, powerful in her independence, free in her self-determination. This aspect of the goddess spoke particularly to those who felt incomplete by society's standards, the unmarried women, the childless wives, the widows who chose not to remarry. In Artemis, they found validation that a woman alone was not a woman diminished. She showed them that solitude could be strength, that choosing oneself was not selfish, but sacred. Yet this independence did not mean isolation. Artemis was surrounded by companions who chose to follow her, bound not by obligation, but by love and shared purpose. Her relationships were freely entered and freely maintained, based on mutual respect rather than domination or submission. In this, she modeled a different way of being in the world, one that valued autonomy while celebrating connection. The moon is setting now, and with it, our tale draws toward its close. But the story of Artemis never truly ends, for she is eternal as the moon itself, cycling through phases, but always returning. In every generation, there are those who hear her call the wild ones, the independent ones, the ones who choose the difficult path of self-determination over the easier road of conformity. They find her in urban gardens and national parks, in the phase of the moon that speaks to their hearts, in the moment of choosing themselves over what others expect of them. She is present in the midwife's skilled hands, in the herbalist's ancient knowledge, in the athlete's perfect focus. Wherever women claim their power, wherever the wild places are protected, wherever the moon rises over a world that still contains mystery, Artemis lives. Her temples may have fallen, her formal worship may have ended, but the goddess herself remains. She runs still through the forests of our dreams, silver bow in hand, hounds at her heels, forever free, forever wild, forever herself. In the space between sleeping and waking, between civilization and wilderness, between what we are told to be and what we truly are, we might glimpse her a flash of silver in the darkness, a sound of distant laughter, a feeling of ancient recognition. And now, as the last light fades and true night embraces the world, we leave you in the care of Artemis, protector of all who sleep beneath her moon. May your dreams be filled with silver light and wild places. May you wake refreshed, carrying within you some spark of the goddess' fierce independence. May you remember in the days that follow that there is divinity in choosing your own path, power in protecting what you love, and endless mystery in the dance between darkness and light. The moon sets, the stars wheel overhead, and somewhere in the forests of forever, Artemis continues her eternal hunt. But our journey through her realm is far from complete, for the goddess contains more stories than there are stars in the sky, more faces than the moon shows in a year of turnings. Let us linger a while longer in her silver domain, discovering the lesser-known paths through her mythology, the quiet streams of story that flow between the great rivers of her famous tales. In the mountains of Hyperborea, that legendary land beyond the north wind where the sun shines always and sorrow is unknown, Artemis kept a special sanctuary. Here, the ordinary rules of the world did not apply. Winter never touched these peaks, and the animals lived without fear of the hunt. It was said that once a year, Artemis would release all the souls of the animals killed in hunts throughout the world, and they would run free in these eternal meadows before choosing whether to return to Earth or remain in paradise. The Hyperborean priests of Artemis were unique among her followers. They were male, which was unusual for her cults, but they had taken vows of chastity as severe as any of her nymphs. These priests understood the language of every beast and bird, could run for days without tiring, and aged so slowly that generations of ordinary humans would pass while they remained young. They served the goddess not through blood sacrifice, but through preservation, maintaining her sacred lands in perfect balance. One of these priests, Abaris, became legendary for his journeys throughout the ancient world. He carried with him a golden arrow of Artemis that allowed him to travel without food or rest, flying above the earth when necessary. Wherever he went, he established new groves sacred to the goddess, teaching local peoples how to honor her without violating her sacred laws. His arrow could also cure diseases and purify corrupted places, for it carried the essence of Artemis' own power. The story is told of how Abaris came to a city plagued by a terrible sickness. The people had cut down a grove sacred to Artemis to build new houses, and in her anger, the goddess had sent a wasting disease that particularly affected women and children. The city's leaders, proud and stubborn, refused to acknowledge their crime, insisting that progress demanded sacrifice, and that the old ways must give way to the new. Abaris did not argue with them. Instead, he planted his golden arrow in the center of the city's main square. Immediately, a spring burst forth from the earth, and around it, trees began to grow with supernatural speed. Within hours, a new grove stood in the heart of the city, more beautiful than the one that had been destroyed. The sick who drank from the spring were healed, but more than that, they were changed. They began to dream of forests, to hunger for wild places, to feel trapped within the city walls. One by one, families began to leave, following an irresistible call to establish new settlements that honored both civilization and wilderness. The city, which had sought to expand by destroying nature, instead became smaller, humbler, wiser. The grove at its heart reminded all who saw it that Artemis' power could not be denied, only respected or suffered. This balance between human ambition and natural law appears again and again in the stories of Artemis. She did not hate humanity or civilization itself, but she demanded recognition that there were limits to human dominion. The wise king left certain forests untouched. The clever farmer maintained wild borders around his fields. The prudent city kept sacred groves within its walls. Those who forgot these accommodations learned, always painfully, that the goddess' memory was long and her justice inevitable. Consider the tale of Agrius and Aureus, sons of Polyphont, whose story shows how violation of natural law passes through generations. Polyphont had been one of Artemis' companions, sworn to chastity, but she fell in love with a bear. Such a union was an abomination, mixing human and animal in ways that violated the proper order. Artemis, disgusted, transformed Polyphont into an owl, a bird that would forever hunt in darkness, separated from both human and animal society. But the sons she had already conceived were born as monsters, giants who knew no law but hunger. They devoured travelers, showed no respect for the gods, and turned the lands around them into wastelands of fear. Artemis watched their depredations with cold fury, waiting for the proper moment to act. When they finally attacked pilgrims traveling to one of her festivals, she struck, but her punishment was subtle and terrible. She transformed them into birds, but not noble eagles or clever ravens. They became vultures, forever hungry, forever feeding on the dead, forever unclean. The transformation of wrongdoers into animals was one of Artemis' most common punishments, but it was never random. The form always reflected the crime. The lustful became goats or boars, consumed by animal passion. The proud became stags, magnificent but hunted. The cruel became wolves or wild dogs, turned against their own kind. In each transformation, there was a lesson for those wise enough to see it. But Artemis could also use transformation as a reward or rescue. The story of Arethusa shows this gentler aspect of the goddess power. Arethusa was a nymph of exceptional beauty who served in Artemis' train. One day, after a particularly long hunt, she came upon a clear river and decided to bathe. The water was cool and inviting, and she swam with joy, not knowing that she had entered the domain of Alpheus, a river god who instantly desired her. When Arethusa realized the water itself was alive with divine lust, she fled in terror, calling upon Artemis for aid. The river god pursued her, flowing across the land in an unnatural flood, always just behind her flying feet. Arethusa ran until her strength failed, until she could taste the spray of Alpheus reaching for her. In that moment of desperation, Artemis answered. She wrapped her follower in a cloud, and within that concealment, transformed Arethusa into a spring of pure water. But Alpheus was persistent in his desire. He recognized the taste of Arethusa's essence, even in her transformed state, and sought to mingle his waters with hers. So Artemis performed an even greater miracle. She opened a channel beneath the earth, all the way under the sea, allowing Arethusa to flow from Greece to Sicily, emerging on the island of Ortygia, where a great temple to Artemis stood. There, protected by the goddess presence, Arethusa remains to this day, a spring of sweet water surrounded by the salt sea, forever pure, forever protected. This theme of protection through transformation appears in many forms throughout Artemis mythology. When the giant Talos pursued one of her nymphs, Artemis transformed the girl into a spring that sank deep into the earth where no hand could reach. When the beautiful Phileno was beset by numerous suitors who would not accept her vows of chastity, Artemis transformed her into a tree, granting her the peace she sought. The transformations were not punishments, but gifts, allowing her followers to remain true to their essential nature in a world that sought to force them into unwanted shapes. The goddess' protection extended beyond individuals to entire species. Every animal was sacred to her, but some held special significance. The bear, of course, was particularly beloved, for reasons that varied depending on which story you believed. Some said that Artemis had been nursed by a bear when Leto, exhausted from her wanderings, could produce no milk. Others claimed that the goddess could take the form of a great she-bear when she wished, and that all bears were her earthly representatives. The Coronician hind, with its golden antlers and bronze hooves, was so sacred to Artemis that even to harm it accidentally brought curse upon the hunter. When Heracles was tasked with capturing it as one of his labors, he pursued it for a full year, following it to the ends of the earth. Even he, strongest of mortals, dared not wound it, knowing Artemis' wrath would fall upon him. When he finally succeeded in capturing it with a net, Artemis appeared before him, ready to strike him down for daring to touch her sacred animal. Only by explaining his servitude to Eurystheus and promising to release the hind unharmed did Heracles escape the goddess' anger. Even then, she marked him with her displeasure, and some say his later madness was partly due to this encounter, a delayed punishment for handling what should never have been touched by mortal hands, even with the best intentions. The sacred nature of certain animals created complex relationships between Artemis and the mortals who shared their world. Hunters had to learn which beasts could be pursued and which must be left alone. A white deer was always sacred, never to be killed. A bear with cubs was under the goddess' special protection. Any animal that sought sanctuary in one of her groves became inviolate, even if it had been wounded and tracked for days. These rules created a sophisticated understanding of conservation long before the concept had a name. Artemis laws ensured that certain populations remained untouched, that breeding seasons were respected, that the balance between predator and prey was maintained. Her priests taught that taking too much from the forest was like drawing too much water from a well eventually. there would be nothing left, and all would suffer. The goddess also governed the mysteries of animal behavior that humans could observe, but not fully understand. Why did deer gather in certain glades on particular nights? Why did wolves howl at the moon in patterns that seemed almost like language? Why did certain birds migrate vast distances to specific groves? These were Artemis mysteries, and wise humans did not probe too deeply, understanding that some knowledge was not meant for mortal minds. Yet for those who approached with proper reverence, the goddess might share certain secrets. Her priests knew which plants would attract game and which would repel predators. They understood the signs that preceded harsh winters or bountiful springs. They could read the health of the forest in the behavior of its smallest inhabitants. This knowledge came not from study, but from gift, granted to those who proved themselves worthy through years of patient service. The training of Artemis priests and priestesses was unlike that of any other cult. While other temples focused on memorizing prayers and perfecting rituals, hers demanded physical prowess and wilderness survival skills. Initiates learned to move silently through the densest undergrowth, to find water in the driest season, to build shelters that left no trace. They studied the stars for navigation, the plants for medicine, the tracks of every creature that walked or flew or crawled. But the physical training was only preparation for the spiritual mysteries. In the deepest forests, in caves known only to the initiated, rituals were performed that connected the worshippers directly to the wild heart of nature. These ceremonies cannot be fully described, for their power lay partly in their secrecy, but fragments have survived in whispered stories and half-remembered dreams. They spoke of dancing until the boundaries between self and forest dissolved, of running with the night wind until human consciousness merged with something older and wider. They told of a presence that was Artemis, but also more than Artemis, the living spirit of wilderness itself, ancient beyond imagining, neither kind nor cruel, but simply real in a way that human-centered deities could never be. Some initiates emerged from these experiences, changed in ways that went beyond words. They could call animals with a gesture, calm storms with a song, find their way in absolute darkness, but they also carried a wildness in their eyes that never quite faded, a distance from ordinary human concerns that could be disturbing to those who loved them. They had touched something fundamental and untamed, and it had left its mark upon their souls. The goddess' influence on human society extended far beyond her formal worship. In many Greek cities, the transition from childhood to adulthood was marked by rituals that honored Artemis. Boys would offer toy weapons at her altars, acknowledging that true strength meant knowing when not to fight. Girls would dedicate their dolls, recognizing that growing up meant choosing which aspects of childhood to preserve and which to leave behind. These rituals were not mere formalities, but profound acknowledgments of life's transitions. Artemis governed all thresholds between wild and tame, child and adult, life and death. By honoring her at these crucial moments, people sought her blessing for the journey ahead, while also recognizing what was being left behind. The goddess of eternal maidenhood paradoxically presided over the loss of innocence, understanding that preservation and transformation were two faces of the same mystery. In Sparta, this connection was particularly strong. The agoge, the brutal training system that turned boys into warriors, included significant elements of Artemis worship. Boys were sent into the wild with minimal supplies, forced to survive by their wits and strength. They learned to hunt and trap, to endure cold and hunger, to move unseen through hostile territory. All these skills were practical for future soldiers, but they were also spiritual exercises, ways of connecting with the primal forces that Artemis embodied. The famous Spartan women, renowned for their strength and independence, were especially devoted to Artemis. They exercised naked like men, scandalized visitors with their freedom of movement and speech, and chose their own husbands rather than being given in marriage. In all this, they followed the model of the goddess who bowed to no man, who found her completion in her own strength rather than in relationship to others. But it was not only in Sparta that Artemis influenced the lives of women. Throughout the Greek world, her worship provided spaces where women could gather away from male oversight. In her groves and temples, they could speak freely, share knowledge that was usually suppressed, and support each other through the trials of female existence in a patriarchal world. The goddess who had chosen freedom gave her worshippers a taste of what freedom might mean. These gatherings were not rebellious in any overt way. Artemis was, after all, a recognized and honored goddess, but they planted seeds of possibility in women's minds. If a goddess could choose eternal virginity and suffer no punishment, if she could run free through the forests with no male guardian, if she could demand respect through her own power rather than through association with father or husband, then perhaps the limitations placed on mortal women were not as natural and inevitable as they seemed. The medical knowledge preserved and transmitted in Artemis temples was particularly significant. While male physicians theorized about women's bodies, often with spectacular inaccuracy, the priestesses of Artemis dealt with the reality of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. They knew which herbs could ease labor pains, which could prevent conception, which could cleanse the womb after miscarriage. This knowledge, passed from woman to woman under the protection of the goddess, provided a degree of bodily autonomy that official society did not acknowledge. The temples also served as refuges for women fleeing abusive situations. A woman who could reach an altar of Artemis and claim sanctuary was protected by divine law. While she remained within the temple grounds, no one could force her to return to an unwanted marriage or violent home. Some women stayed only long enough to negotiate better terms for their return. Others took vows and remained forever, finding in service to the goddess a life that, while restricted in some ways, offered more freedom than the world outside. Children born in these temples occupied a special position in society. Officially fatherless, they were considered children of the goddess herself. They often displayed unusual abilities, exceptional skill with animals, prophetic dreams, healing gifts. Some became wandering priests, carrying Artemis worship to new lands. Others remained in the temples, forming dynasties of sacred servants that lasted for generations. The economic activities of Artemis temples were also unique. While other temples grew wealthy from donations and land ownership, hers were largely self-sufficient through hunting, gathering, and careful forest management. Her priests were expert beekeepers, producing honey and wax of exceptional quality. They gathered medicinal herbs that grew nowhere else, tended by secret methods. They raised hunting dogs whose bloodlines were kept pure through centuries, producing animals of legendary skill and loyalty. This economic independence reinforced the theological independence at the heart of Artemis worship. Her temples needed no wealthy patrons, no royal favor, no elaborate supply chains from distant lands. Everything they required could be found in the forests and fields around them, provided one had the knowledge and skill to find it. This self-sufficiency was itself a form of worship, a living demonstration of the goddess teaching that freedom came from needing less, not from having more. As we delve deeper into the night and into our story, let us explore the darker aspects of Artemis worship, the mysteries that were whispered rather than spoken aloud. For the goddess of the hunt was also the goddess of the sacrifice, and blood was as much a part of her rituals as moonlight. Not the tame blood of domestic animals led willingly to altars, but the wild blood of the hunt, the hot splash of life leaving a body that had fought to keep it. In certain remote sanctuaries, rituals were performed that echoed the most ancient practices of humanity, from the time before Zeus ruled Olympus, before civilization drew its careful boundaries between human and animal, sacred and profane. These were not cruel rites, but acknowledgments of cruel truths that life fed on death, that the hunter could become the hunted, that the goddess who protected also destroyed. The Taurian Artemis demanded human sacrifice, though by classical times this had been softened to symbolic rituals. But the memory remained of times when shipwrecked strangers were offered on her altars, their blood feeding the earth that fed all life. Even in more civilized places, echoes of these practices survived. At Hali Araphanites, a man's throat was scratched with a knife until blood flowed, a reminder of older, darker offerings. These bloody rituals served multiple purposes. They reminded worshippers that Artemis was not a comfortable goddess, not a tame protector, who asked nothing in return for her gifts. They reinforced the reality of death that urban life tried to hide, that every meal came from killing, that survival meant something else's ending. They also bound the community together through shared transgression, shared acknowledgement of the violence that underlay even the most peaceful existence. But perhaps most importantly, they honored the wild part of human nature that civilization sought to suppress. In the controlled context of ritual, worshippers could touch their own capacity for violence, their own animal nature, without being consumed by it. They could acknowledge the hunter within, the part that thrilled to the chase and the kill, and then return to their normal lives, having integrated rather than denied this aspect of themselves. The mythology surrounding these darker rituals was complex and often contradictory. Some stories said that Artemis demanded blood sacrifice as payment for ancient crimes against her. Others suggested that the rituals were protective, offering controlled violence to prevent uncontrolled slaughter. Still, others hinted that the blood fed not Artemis herself, but older, hungrier powers that she kept leashed through careful propitiation. The truth, as always with divine matters, was probably all of these and none of them. Artemis contained multitudes, and her worship reflected the full spectrum of natural existence. She was the gentle deer and the pursuing wolf, the protective mother bear, and the eagle carrying off the hare's young. To worship her fully meant accepting all these aspects, not choosing only the comfortable ones. This acceptance of duality extended to the goddess' own myths. Stories of her compassion existed alongside tales of her cruelty, and her worshippers understood that both were true. The same goddess who saved Iphigenia from sacrifice also demanded Agamemnon's daughter in the first place. The protector of women's chastity also sent the wild urges that could destroy it. The guardian of childbirth also brought the sudden deaths that left cradles empty. Modern minds might struggle with these contradictions, wanting their deities to be consistent, comprehensible, safe, but the ancient worshippers of Artemis knew better. They understood that nature itself was contradictory, that the same rain that nourished could also flood, that the forest that provided could also devour. In accepting Artemis in all her aspects, they accepted reality itself, without the comforting filters that distance us from the fundamental truths of existence. This acceptance brought its own form of peace. There was no need to explain why bad things happened to good people when you worshipped a goddess who embodied both preservation and destruction. There was no crisis of faith when prayers went unanswered, for Artemis had never promised to be amenable to human desires. She was what she was: wild, free, dangerous, protective, cruel, kind, all things in their season. Her worshippers learned to read the signs of her moods like hunters reading weather. When the moon was dark, her wilder aspects held sway, and wise people stayed indoors. When she showed her full face, celebrations could be held in relative safety. The appearance of certain animals, the blooming of particular flowers, the patterns of wind in the trees, all these spoke of the goddess' intentions to those who knew how to interpret them. This constant attention to natural signs created a people deeply attuned to their environment. They noticed changes that others missed, patterns that revealed themselves only to patient observation. In a world without weather forecasts or scientific understanding of natural phenomena, this sensitivity could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Artemis' gift to her followers was not protection from nature, but understanding of it. The goddess' relationship with other deities also reflected this complex understanding of natural forces. While she often opposed Aphrodite, goddess of love and sexuality, she also worked with her when necessary. The two goddesses represented different aspects of female power: Artemis, the untouchable; Aphrodite, the irresistible. Their conflicts and collaborations played out in countless mortal lives as women navigated between independence and relationship, chastity and sexuality. With Demeter, goddess of agriculture, Artemis maintained an uneasy peace. They ruled adjacent realms: Demeter, the cultivated fields; Artemis, the wild forests. The boundary between their domains was constantly negotiated as humans cleared forests for farmland or allowed fields to return to wilderness. Their priests often worked together, ensuring that enough wild land remained to maintain the balance that both goddesses required. The relationship with Hecate was particularly complex, as both goddesses ruled liminal spaces and were associated with the moon. Some stories made them aspects of the same divine force, along with Selene, the famous triple goddess of maiden, mother, and crone. Though Artemis' eternal virginity complicated this neat categorization, in practice, their worshippers often honored both, understanding that the crossroads Hecate guarded and the wild paths Artemis protected were part of the same network of spaces outside ordinary human control. With her twin brother Apollo, the relationship was most complex of all. They were partners and opposites, supportive and competitive, united in some stories and bitterly divided in others. This tension reflected a fundamental divide in human nature itself, between the impulse to civilize and the need to remain wild, between reason and instinct, between the desire to illuminate and the need for shadow. Their dual nature was celebrated in various festivals throughout the Greek world. At Delos, their birthplace, games were held that honored both deities. Athletes competed in sports that required both physical prowess and mental strategy. Musicians performed compositions that moved from harmonious melodies to wild, almost chaotic passages. The winners were those who could embody both aspects, who could be both rational and instinctive as the moment required. As our story continues deeper into the night, let us speak of the places sacred to Artemis, for understanding her geography is essential to understanding the goddess herself. Beyond the famous sanctuaries at Ephesus and Brauron, countless smaller shrines dotted the ancient landscape. Each had its own character, its own specific aspect of the goddess that it honored, its own traditions passed down through generations of worshippers. In the mountains of Arcadia, ancient even by Greek standards, stood groves that had been sacred to Artemis since before human memory. The trees there were enormous, their trunks so vast that a dozen people holding hands could not encircle them. These trees had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, had sheltered worshippers of gods whose names were forgotten before Zeus was born. In their shade, mysteries were performed that connected participants directly to the primordial forces of nature. The Arcadian Artemis was wilder than her manifestations elsewhere. She ran with wolves rather than deer, carried a spear rather than a bow, wore skins rather than a tunic. Her priests painted themselves with mud and blood, danced naked under the full moon, howled responses to the night hunters, civilized Greeks from Athens or Corinth, who witnessed these rites, returned home shaken, having glimpsed something that made their own religious practices seem like mere theatrical performances. Yet even this wild goddess protected her own. Lost children who wandered into her Arcadian groves were found days later, well fed and unharmed, with stories of a tall woman who taught them which berries were safe to eat and how to find water. Shepherds caught in sudden mountain storms would discover caves that seemed to appear from nowhere, stocked with dry wood and even food. The goddess might be wild, but she was not without compassion for those who respected her domain. On the island of Lemnos, Artemis was worshipped as the bearer of healing fire. The volcanic island's hot springs were sacred to her, and pilgrims came from across the Aegean seeking cures for ailments that resisted all other treatment. The priestesses there practiced a form of healing that combined hydrotherapy with herbal medicine and sacred dance. They said that Artemis had taught them how to use the earth's own fever to burn out human illness, how to channel volcanic fire for healing rather than destruction. The mysteries of Lemnian Artemis included fire-walking rituals that demonstrated the initiate's trust in the goddess' protection. Participants would dance barefoot across beds of glowing coals, emerging unburned if their faith was pure. Skeptics suggested that the priestesses knew secrets of preparation that protected the feet, but initiates insisted that it was Artemis herself who stood between them and the flames, that they felt her cool presence even in the heart of the fire. In Crete, that ancient island where civilization first flowered in the Aegean, Artemis merged with even older goddess figures. There she was Britamartis, the sweet virgin who chose transformation over violation, and Dictona, lady of the nets. The Cretan goddess ruled both the mountains and the sea, protecting fishermen as well as hunters. Her sacred animals included dolphins and seals, alongside the more traditional deer and bears. The Cretan rituals involved elaborate dances that told the story of the goddess, various transformations and escapes. Young women, dressed in costumes that could quickly be changed to represent different animals or elements, would enact the myths, while musicians played increasingly frantic music. The dances would continue for hours, with participants dropping out when exhausted and others taking their place, creating a continuous narrative that could last all night. At Patri in Achaea, a curious form of divination was practiced in Artemis' name. A mirror was lowered into a sacred spring on a cord, positioned so that it just touched the water's surface. Sick people would peer into this mirror, and the images they saw would reveal whether they would recover or die. The priestesses claimed that Artemis showed true reflections of the future to those brave enough to look, though whether the prophecies were self-fulfilling or genuinely oracular remained a matter of debate. The goddess' reach extended beyond the Greek world proper. In Anatolia, she absorbed characteristics of the great mother goddesses who had been worshipped there for millennia. The famous many-breasted statue of Ephesian Artemis shocked Greeks, who expected their virgin huntress. But locals understood that divinity could take many forms. The breasts might have been eggs, or bull's testicles, or even dates, symbols of fertility and abundance that seemed to contradict Artemis' virginity, but actually spoke to her role as protector of all life. In Thrace, wild lands north of Greece proper, Artemis was worshipped alongside Bendis, a local goddess who shared many of her characteristics. The Thracian rituals were notorious for their intensity, all-night torch races through forest paths, ecstatic dances that led to prophetic trances, hunt rituals where the line between human and animal became dangerously thin. Greek observers reported seeing worshippers transform into beasts, though whether this was literal truth or ecstatic identification remained unclear. The Black Sea regions knew Artemis as the terrible virgin who demanded human sacrifice. The Taurians, a people the Greeks considered barbarian, maintained ancient practices that more civilized worshippers had abandoned. Yet, even here, the goddess showed mercy to those who served her faithfully. The story of Iphigenia, installed as her priestess among the Taurians, showed that even in her darkest manifestations, Artemis could be a protector and liberator. As trade routes expanded and Greek influence spread, Artemis traveled with them. In Egypt, she was identified with Bastet, the cat goddess who shared her ferocity and independence. In Syria, with various local goddesses of animals and hunt. Each identification brought new elements to her worship, new stories to her mythology, new faces to her infinitely variable nature. Yet through all these transformations and identifications, certain core elements remained constant. Artemis was always the goddess of wild things, the protector of the vulnerable, the fierce virgin who chose her own path. Whether she was depicted as Greek huntress or Anatolian mother, Thracian ecstatic or Egyptian cat, these essential qualities persisted. Her worshippers might speak different languages and perform different rituals, but they all understood that they honored a power that existed outside human control, that predated human civilization, that would endure long after human cities had crumbled to dust. The goddess' influence on art and literature was profound and lasting. Poets sang of her beauty and terror, her compassion and cruelty. Sculptors struggled to capture her dual nature in stone maiden and destroyer, protector and hunter. The famous statue by Praxiteles showed her reaching for an arrow from her quiver, caught in the moment between decision and action, embodying the tension that defined her nature. In vase paintings, she appeared in countless scenes, overseeing the hunt, punishing transgressors, protecting suppliants, dancing with her nymphs. Each artist brought their own understanding to their depictions, yet certain conventions emerged. She was always shown as young, but never childish, beautiful, but never soft, armed, but not aggressive and less provoked. Her animals surrounded her like a living aura, marking her as mistress of the natural world. The literary tradition preserved stories that visual art could only hint at. Poets spoke of her voice, which could be gentle as a dove's coo or terrible as a lion's roar. They described the sound of her silver bow, like wind through winter branches. They tried to capture in words the impossibility of her eternal virginity, combined with her role as midwife, her distance from human concerns, combined with her intimate involvement in human lives. But perhaps the most profound influence of Artemis was not in art or literature, but in the lives of ordinary people who found in her a model for resistance to societal expectations. Every woman who chose career over marriage, every person who found fulfillment in solitude rather than relationship, every individual who refused to be tamed or controlled could look to Artemis as divine validation of their choices. This influence extended to men as well, particularly those who felt called to lives outside conventional masculine roles. Her male priests, who took vows of chastity and lived apart from the competitive world of Greek masculinity, showed that there were other ways to be a man than warrior or patriarch. Hunters who followed her ethics, taking only what they needed and respecting the spirits of their prey, demonstrated a different relationship with violence than the glorified bloodshed of war. As night deepens around us and sleep draws ever closer, let us turn to the most mysterious aspects of Artemis, worship the practices that were barely spoken of even in antiquity, the rituals that touched the deepest and most dangerous currents of divine power. For there were ceremonies performed in her name that went beyond ordinary worship, that sought not just to honor the goddess, but to become her, if only for a brief, terrifying moment. In certain secret groves, on nights when the moon was dark and only initiates were present, The barriers between human and divine, mortal and immortal, civilized and wild, were deliberately broken down. Through combinations of fasting, sacred herbs, rhythmic dancing, and induced trance states, worshippers sought to experience reality as Artemis experienced it, without the filters of human consciousness, without the limitations of human perception. These experiences were dangerous. Not everyone who entered the trance state returned unchanged. Some came back with gifts, the ability to speak with animals, to find healing herbs by instinct, to predict weather with uncanny accuracy. Others returned damaged, their minds fractured by contact with forces too vast for human comprehension. Still others did not return at all. Their bodies found days later in the forest, unmarked but lifeless, their spirits apparently choosing to remain in whatever realm they had touched. The priests and priestesses who guided these ceremonies carried tremendous responsibility. They had to judge who was ready for such experiences, who had the strength to survive direct contact with divinity. They had to know how to call spirits back when they wandered too far, how to anchor consciousness in flesh when it sought to dissolve entirely. They walked a constant line between ecstasy and madness, revelation and destruction. The knowledge gained from these extreme practices filtered down into less dangerous forms of worship. The understanding of consciousness-altering plants led to medical applications. The techniques for inducing trance states were adapted for healing traumatic memories. The ability to identify with animals enhanced hunting practices and animal husbandry. Even those who never participated in the deepest mysteries benefited from the knowledge won by those who dared to touch the divine directly. But there was always a price. Those who had truly experienced Artemis consciousness could never fully return to ordinary human life. They remained marked, set apart, carrying within them a wildness that showed in their eyes and movements. They might function in society, might even excel in roles that required understanding of nature or healing, or the mysteries of life and death. But they were never quite the same, never quite able to forget what they had seen and felt and been. These marked ones often became wanderers, moving from shrine to shrine, forest to forest, carrying messages and maintaining connections between far-flung communities of worshippers. They were welcomed wherever they went, for they brought news and knowledge and the direct presence of the goddess touch. But they rarely stayed long, driven by a restlessness that was both blessing and curse, both gift and burden. Through their travels, they maintained the network of Artemis worship across the ancient world. They ensured that innovations in one place spread to others, that local traditions were preserved even as they evolved, that the goddess worship remained both unified and diverse. They were living embodiments of Artemis herself, free, wild, dangerous, protective, forever in motion, forever beyond capture or complete understanding. As we near the end of our long journey through the myths and mysteries of Artemis, let us consider her relevance to those who came after the ancient world, who lived in times when her temples had fallen and her formal worship had ended. For the goddess did not disappear when the old religions gave way to new ones. She simply changed forms, went underground, found new ways to manifest in a world that no longer acknowledged her by name. In the Middle Ages, she lived on in the figure of the wild woman, the forest-dwelling wise woman who knew herbs and helped with births and lived outside the bounds of ordinary society. The church might call such women witches, might burn them for their knowledge and independence, but they were simply following patterns laid down by Artemis priestesses millennia before. The goddess protected them when she could, appearing as a white deer to lead pursuers astray, or as a sudden mist that concealed escape routes. She influenced the cult of the Virgin Mary, particularly in her aspects as protector of women and intercessor for the suffering. The Black Madonnas found in caves and forest shrines throughout Europe often stood on sites sacred to Artemis, and their worship preserved elements of the older goddess rituals, the emphasis on Mary's perpetual virginity, her power despite never being touched by man, her ability to command even her divine son. All these echoed Artemis' ancient independence. In folklore, she became Diana of the moon, leader of the wild hunt, racing through the night sky with her ghostly pack. Those who saw her passing knew to avert their eyes, for to look too long was to be swept up in her train, carried away to realms from which few returned. Yet she also appeared as the helpful huntress who aided lost travelers, the mysterious woman who showed herb gatherers where the rarest plants grew, the protector who stood between children and the dangers of the forest. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical mythology, but it was a sanitized Artemis who appeared in paintings and poems beautiful, cold, safely distant, the wild goddess who demanded blood, who drove men mad, who offered terrible freedoms to those who served her, was too dangerous for an age that prided itself on reason and order. Yet even in her diminished form, she influenced artists and writers who sensed something powerful beneath the pretty surface. The Romantic movement came closer to understanding her true nature, its emphasis on wild nature, on emotion over reason, on the individual's direct relationship with the divine. All resonated with Artemis' ancient truths. Poets who wrote of running wild through forests, of finding God in nature rather than churches, of the terrible beauty of untamed places, were channeling her spirit, whether they knew it or not. In the modern world, she manifests in movements for environmental protection, in the fight for women's autonomy, in the recognition that humans are part of nature rather than separate from it. Every woman who chooses her own path despite societal pressure carries a spark of Artemis within her. Every person who fights to preserve wild places from development honors the goddess memory. Every parent who teaches their children to respect rather than than dominate nature, continues her worship. She lives in the national parks and protected wilderness areas, spaces set aside from human exploitation. She runs with the wolves being reintroduced to their ancestral territories, flies with the eagles brought back from the edge of extinction. She stands with indigenous peoples fighting to preserve their lands and traditions, recognizing in them the same understanding of nature's sacredness that her ancient worshippers possessed. Modern witchcraft and pagan movements have reclaimed her worship directly, though their practices often differ significantly from ancient traditions. They honor her at the full moon, call upon her for protection and strength, see in her a model of female power that needs no male validation. If their rituals would seem strange to ancient Greeks, the spirit behind them, the recognition of wildness as sacred, the honoring of female autonomy, the understanding that humans must live in balance with nature, would be immediately recognizable. Even in cities, far from any forest, Artemis finds ways to manifest. She is present in the urban coyote, adapting to life among humans, in the peregrine falcon nesting on skyscrapers, in the weeds that crack through concrete to reach for the sun. She inspires guerrilla gardeners who plant flowers in abandoned lots, urban beekeepers who maintain hives on rooftops, anyone who creates pockets of wildness in the midst of civilization. Her influence on contemporary feminism is profound, though not always acknowledged. The understanding that women have the right to control their own bodies, to choose their own paths, to exist as complete beings without reference to men, all these ideas that seem revolutionary to each generation that rediscovers them were embodied by Artemis from the beginning. She was the original autonomous woman, the divine validation that female independence was not unnatural, but sacred. Yet she also transcends gender, offering a model of selfhood that speaks to anyone who feels called to a path outside societal norms. In an age that increasingly recognizes the fluidity of gender and sexuality, Artemis complex, nature virgin yet midwife, female yet often portrayed with masculine characteristics, gentle yet fierce, provides a divine precedent for those who don't fit neat categories. The ecological movement has unconsciously adopted many of her values. The understanding that wilderness has intrinsic value beyond its usefulness to humans, that biodiversity must be preserved, that humans are part of the web of life rather than its masters. All these echo her ancient teachings. Modern wildlife biologists tracking wolves through pristine forests are her priests as surely as any who served in her temples. Even in our relationship with our companion animals, Artemis' influence persists. The understanding that dogs and cats and other creatures we share our lives with are not property, but partners, that they deserve respect and care, that the bond between human and animal can be sacred. This, too, is part of her legacy. every child who refuses to harm an insect, every person who puts out water for urban wildlife, every individual who sees kinship rather than dominion in their relationship with other species honors the goddess. As we approach the final moments of our tale, as sleep hovers ever closer, let us return one last time to the essential mystery of Artemis, her simultaneous distance from and involvement with humanity. She was the goddess who chose to remain forever apart, forever virgin, forever free. Yet she was also the goddess most intimately involved with the great transitions of human life, birth and death, childhood and adulthood, civilization and wildness. This paradox resolves when we understand that Artemis represents not withdrawal from life, but full engagement with it on one's own terms. Her virginity was not about rejection of others, but about completeness in herself. Her wildness was not about chaos, but about authenticity. Her violence was not about cruelty, but about the honest acknowledgement that life and death are inseparable, that creation and destruction dance together in eternal balance. In choosing to honor Artemis, her worshippers chose to see reality clearly, without comforting illusions. They accepted that nature was not a gentle mother, but a complex force that could nurture and destroy with equal indifference. They understood that true freedom came not from having no boundaries, but from choosing one's own boundaries. They recognized that wildness was not something external to be conquered, but something internal to be acknowledged and integrated. These are not comfortable truths, which is why Artemis was never a comfortable goddess. She offered no easy salvation, no promises of eternal bliss, no escape from the fundamental realities of existence. What she offered instead was strength to face those realities, wisdom to navigate them, and the fierce joy that comes from living authentically. Even when authenticity brings conflict with the expectations of others, her gifts were practical ones: the knowledge of healing herbs, the skill to survive in the wilderness, the strength to protect oneself and one's chosen family. But beyond these material benefits, she gave her followers something precious: the knowledge that there were other ways to be in the world than those prescribed by society. That divinity itself validated their choices to be different, to be free, to be wild. As we prepare to leave the realm of myth and return to the world of sleep and dreams, let us carry with us the essence of what Artemis teaches. In a world that constantly pressures us to conform, to tame ourselves, to choose safety over authenticity, she reminds us that wildness is sacred. In a society that often sees nature as something to be conquered or consumed, she insists that we are part of nature, subject to its laws, dependent on its balance. Her message resonates perhaps even more strongly in our modern world than it did in ancient times. As we face ecological collapse brought on by our failure to respect natural limits, Artemis' teachings about balance and consequence seem prophetic. As we struggle with questions of gender, sexuality, and identity. Her fluid nature and chosen independence offer divine precedent for self-determination. As we deal with the stress of constant connectivity and social pressure, her example of choosing solitude and wildness provides a powerful alternative. But Artemis does not demand that we all become forest hermits or reject human society entirely. Her worship always recognized that most people must live in the world of civilization, with all its compromises and constraints. What she offers is the reminder that civilization is not the only reality, that within each of us lives something wild and free that deserves respect and expression. She gives us permission to honor that wildness, to make space for it in our lives, to refuse to let it be entirely tamed. In the end, Artemis is the goddess of choice, the choice to be oneself despite all pressures to be otherwise, the choice to honor the wild within and without, the choice to recognize that freedom and responsibility, independence and connection, ferocity and gentleness can all exist within the same being. She shows us that divinity itself is complex, contradictory, and ultimately beyond human comprehension, and that this is not a flaw, but a truth that reflects the complexity of existence itself. The moon is setting now, dear listener, and with it, our tale must end. But Artemis remains, running through the forests of our dreams, standing guard at the thresholds of our lives, reminding us always that we are more than what others would make us, that within us lives something eternal and untamed and free, in the darkness that brings rest, in the dreams that carry us to other realms, in the wildness that persists despite all attempts to deny it. The goddess lives on. May her silver light guide you through your dreams tonight. May her fierce protection stand between you and all that would harm you. May her wild freedom inspire you to choose your own path, no matter how difficult or lonely it might sometimes be. And may you wake tomorrow with some echo of her strength within you, ready to face the world with the knowledge that you carry divinity within yourself, wild, free, and forever untamed. Sleep now, blessed by the moon, protected by the huntress, held in the embrace of the eternal wild. In your dreams, you may hear the distant baying of hounds, the silver note of a hunting horn, the whisper of arrows in flight. Do not fear these sounds, they are Artemis passing by, checking on those under her protection, ensuring that even in sleep, even in the vulnerability of dreams, you are not alone. The goddess who stands at all thresholds stands now at the threshold between waking and sleep, between consciousness and dream, between the known world and the mysteries that await in darkness. She guides you across, as she has guided countless souls before you, with the same steady hand that draws the bow, that delivers the child, that leads the lost from darkness into light. Rest now in the knowledge that wildness itself watches over you, that freedom itself stands guard, that the most ancient and powerful forces of nature recognize you as their own. You are a child of the wild, whether you know it or not, heir to freedoms that no human law can grant or take away, blessed by powers that existed before the first city was built, and will endure long after the last one falls to ruins. In the name of Artemis, who runs forever free beneath eternal moons, we bid you peaceful sleep and wild dreams. May you find in the realm of sleep the freedoms that the waking world denies. May you run with the goddess through forests of dream. May you wake renewed and remembering that you too are sacred. You too are wild. You too are free. The moon sets, the stars wheel overhead, and somewhere in the forests of forever, Artemis continues her eternal hunt. But for now, for you, there is only peace, only rest, only the gentle embrace of sleep that comes to all who dwell beneath the moon's protection. The goddess watches over you, as she has watched over countless souls through countless ages. Her silver light a bridge between the world of waking and the realm of dreams. And so our tale ends where it began, in the silver light of the moon, in the presence of the goddess, who is both far and near, both terrible and gentle, both wild and protective. Artemis remains what she has always been, the eternal virgin, the fierce protector, the wild one who cannot be tamed, the free one who shows us the way to our own freedom. Sleep now, and in sleeping, remember that you are more than what the world would make you. Remember that within you lives something that no force on earth can tame. Remember that the goddess herself validates your right to choose your own path, to honor your own nature, to be wild and free and utterly, authentically yourself, in the darkness that brings rest and renewal, in the dreams that reveal truths the waking mind cannot grasp, in the deep peace that comes to those who have heard the old stories and taken them into their hearts. May you find what you seek. May Artemis grant you her gifts, strength for your struggles, wisdom for your choices, wildness for your spirit, and freedom for your soul. And when you wake, may some fragment of this tale remain with you, a silver thread connecting you to the ancient mysteries, a reminder that the old gods still walk for those who have eyes to see them, that the wild places still exist for those who have the courage to seek them, that freedom is always possible for those who have the strength to claim it. The tale is told, the moon has set, and only dreams remain. In those dreams, you may find yourself running through silver forests, bow in hand, following a goddess who is always just ahead, always just out of reach, but whose presence fills you with a joy fierce as hunger, wild as wind, free as the moon itself. This is her final gift, the dream of freedom that once dreamed can never be entirely forgotten. Rest now, dear dreamer. Rest and remember. Rest and be renewed. Tomorrow the world will make its demands upon you, but tonight you belong to the moon, to the wild, to the free goddess who asks nothing of you, but that you be yourself, wholly and authentically, without apology or explanation. In being yourself, you honor her. In choosing freedom, you worship her. In protecting the wild within and without, you serve her. And she, in turn, protects you, guides you, reminds you always that you are more than you know, stronger than you believe, wilder than you dare admit, and freer than any force in heaven or earth can make you or prevent you from being. This is the promise of Artemis, the gift of the moon, the blessing of the wild, that freedom is not granted, but claimed, not given, but taken, not found, but remembered. Sleep deeply, dream wildly, and wake with the knowledge that you have been touched by divinity, blessed by wildness, marked by the moon herself, as one who belongs not to the tame world alone, but to the eternal wild that lives forever at the edges of all things, in the shadows of all forests, in the hearts of all who refuse to be anything less than free. The story ends, but the goddess remains. The moon sets, but it will rise. Again, the wild retreats, but it can never be destroyed. And you, having heard this tale, carry within you now a spark of that eternal fire, a fragment of that endless freedom, a blessing from the goddess who was, who is, and who always will be Artemis the untamed, the unbound, the forever free. May her wildness wake within you. May her freedom flow through you. May her strength sustain you through all the tame days ahead, until you find your way back to the wild places, within or without, where she still runs beneath eternal moons, where freedom still means something more than words, where you can be what you truly are without fear or shame or limitation. This is her gift. This is her promise. This is her eternal blessing upon all who honor the wild, protect the free, and refuse to be tamed. Sleep now and receive it. Dream now and remember it. Wake tomorrow and live it, for you are Artemis' own, now and always, marked by moon, blessed by wild, freed by the simple act of hearing, and believing the ancient truth that freedom is your birthright, wildness your inheritance, and no power in heaven or earth can take from you what the goddess herself has given. Sleep, dream, remember, and when you wake, run free,